I'm joined by Romain Caillaud, who's the Managing Director from corporate advisory firm Vriens and Partners in Burma. Romain, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for interviewing us. Thank you.
So there seems to be a lot of positive atmosphere about the economy right now. Last year GDP grew by 7.5%, and this year there's projections that it's going to grow by 9%. But are people getting carried away with this expected growth, or are they right to be positive and optimistic?
Well, clearly when you sit in Rangoon, the commercial capital still, you see the difference. You see a lot of construction sites, a lot of new cars, a lot of new shops, more products in the shops. So there seems to be an economic boom. But how much of it is being felt outside of Yangon or of the main cities in rural areas, that remains to be seen. I mean, one could look at data or one could look at people and ask their opinion. My impression is that for most persons who actually rely on the land, on agriculture, they still have to see quite a difference in their life and quite an improvement in their standard of living. A number of steps have been taken already, more loans being granted to farmers, also a number of development programs through some of the international financial institutions, but also the government has been trying to provide funds at the township level to support small-scale infrastructure projects, for example. But still, overall, I think expectations have not been met.
Okay, and for the average person on the street, how will they be able to see an improvement?
Well, clearly when their purchasing power increases, when they are able to afford more, when they have access to better and cheaper public services, for example, education or healthcare. And all of these areas are slowly improving, but probably not as fast as people would like them to.
Okay, so expected growth, but it's still, not that positive just yet.
It's very positive what is happening, but to what extent it's benefiting the whole population in a similar manner, that's not so clear, right? I think maybe some of the wealth that is generated is still concentrated in part of the country or with some of the population, and it will only progressively spread to more remote areas. Yes, but still, I mean, it's very important to keep in mind that the situation today is quite different from the situation 3 or 4 years ago, even in very remote areas, for example, close to the borders with Thailand or with China or with India, where actually, partly thanks to the peace process, there are more opportunities for communities in these areas to generate wealth.
So what is standing in the way of economic growth in Burma?
Well, you know as well as I do where this country is coming from. Decades under a military government and some economic policies that were misguided. And so change has started since 2011, and in a number of areas, for example, the financial sector or infrastructure or social protection, good initiatives are being started, but really for the impact of these reforms to kick in and to benefit the whole population and not only urban dwellers, it's going to take time.
Okay, and what about Burma has a lack of a skilled workforce, and there's economists out there that say one of the key elements to growth is having a skilled workforce. So how will this country go from a rural economy to having this skilled workforce?
Well, that's surely a challenge, especially with an education system that has suffered from underinvestment for so many years. But there is a reform of the education sector that has been started. Also, there are a lot of initiatives, private or supported by aid, around vocational training or technical training. So it's starting. But sure, it's going to take years. An opportunity for Myanmar also is to attract back some of its citizens who moved abroad over the last decades in Thailand or Malaysia for manual workers, in Singapore for engineers, technicians, people who work in the financial sector, and beyond in the UK and the US, in Australia. So that's also a pool of qualified workers originally from Myanmar that could come back here and help support the economy.
Do you think they will be willing to come back?
Well, it depends what kind of incentives are provided to them. It depends also what type of personal attachments they have kept with this country, whether they still have family here. And at the end, it's a very much personal choice.
To what extent will foreign firms fill the void and be responsible for providing training to Burmese people?
Well, I think that's, thanks for that question, because actually I think that's a role that foreign companies will play very much. I mean, they come into the country with expertise and experience that they have developed over many years across the world in other countries, including emerging markets similar or that used to be similar to Myanmar. So definitely I think you will see, I mean, first you see a lot of the qualified workforce being attracted by positions with these multinationals or foreign companies. And that's partly thanks to the salary or the benefits that are being provided, but also because of the experience, the training, the exposure. And but maybe these individuals will progressively move back to local companies or decide to leave and set up their own shops, their own firms. And so yes, definitely I think that's an area where foreign companies will provide some value to the country.
And there's a lot of foreign companies now that have their eye on Burma and are moving in because of the investment opportunities. If you were one such investor, which sector would you want to invest in?
Well, so basically you will have the investors or the companies, the multinationals or the companies that do what they do, and they are not coming here to look for any type of opportunities. They are coming here because they see opportunities in the sectors they work in. For example, in telecoms. The two foreign operators who obtain the licenses, Ooredoo and Telenor, they have a lot of experience across Asia, across the world. This is what they do, right? Same for oil and gas, same often for fast-moving consumer goods. Yeah, but so I think those investors, they come here when they see an opportunity in their sector. And then you have investment funds or venture capitalists who will come here and look at in what sector can they get a fast return on their investment. And maybe they will look at property or hotels or maybe agriculture. I mean, it depends what models they use and what rate of returns they are expecting over what number of years.
So, for example, in the telecoms industry, you know, what are the positives and what are the risks of getting involved in there?
Sure. Well, in telecoms, you have really different ways to get involved. And the operators, so the two that obtain the licenses, either they were getting it or they were out. And so that was a very specific time. And now they are working with tower companies, with equipment suppliers, who will decide to come in based on their regional strategy, based on their ability to deploy a team here or not. I mean, often these international companies, they don't only think about Myanmar, they think about the world, Asia, and Myanmar, how it fits in that strategy. And so, yeah. So for example, in oil and gas, you saw a lot of majors of oil and gas, of big oil and gas companies from around the world participated in the recent offshore tender. But for example, BP, a very prominent British company, did not. And that's because it is tied up in other countries. It has other concerns or other issues to deal with. So yes, even if there might be opportunities in one sector, that doesn't mean that the opportunity is of interest to any company.
Sure, and So what do companies coming in any sector and these big investment companies who have operations all over the world, what do they have to look out for? I mean, there's the element of being a responsible business in this country that may not have been necessary in the past, or companies may not have followed that route in the past.
Right.
But now there is this move to be responsible because the country is opening up, there's more checks, people holding people to account. What do businesses have to do to make sure they're responsible when working with, say, local stakeholders?
Right. So often these large companies have processes in place, or they have experience dealing with such issues in other countries. Now what they need is an understanding of the local context, an understanding of what the people and the government of Myanmar want from them, and what will be the expectations. For example, from a religious perspective, from a cultural perspective. So they are usually very keen first to hire locally as much as they can, because that's very often where you will get the best insights on the country among the people who work with you every day. But also they will consult with all type of stakeholders, including very often civil society. They will read the local or watch local media, so they will try to localize their responsible practices.
Corruption is still widespread in Burma, despite the anti-corruption law being passed, and now you have this anti-bribery commission that was set up in February. Is this making any difference, and will this commission be implemented, considering that corruption is so pervasive in every sector of society? Do you think that it will work?
Well, on the law and the commission, it's difficult for me to judge. I mean, the commission does not have a track record yet. There seems to be a lot of good intentions in Naypyidaw across government to crack down on corruption and bribery, but not only in a coercive way, but also trying to find practical manners to prevent corruption from happening, right? To root out the system that is at the core of corruption here. So but I'm not in a position to judge what has happened so far, because there is very little yet, and what will happen in the future. I think overall it's important to remember that Myanmar does not necessarily perform so badly compared to its ASEAN neighbors, and that maybe for some years, well, maybe the past was different, but nowadays, if you were to compare Myanmar with the situation in Thailand or Vietnam or Cambodia or Indonesia, well, maybe there will be a lot of similarities. And I think overall, it's important to ask Myanmar to meet performance standards that it can achieve in a realistic manner. You can't ask Myanmar to be Switzerland or Norway within the coming 2 years.
The stock exchange is due to launch this year in Rangoon. Will this mean we'll be seeing crazy scenes like the New York trading floor in Rangoon?
Right, the Wolf of Yangon maybe. Well, first, as many other deadlines in Myanmar, this one might not be met again. And a stock exchange in Myanmar in 2015 is very likely not to happen. Let's be realistic. And that's the case. I mean, it's very often here, there are very ambitious deadlines being put in place that maybe sometimes cannot be met. But at the same time, it's good to have an objective and to move towards it. Well, stock exchanges in the region, there is quite a good one in Thailand, also good ones in Vietnam, those are newer. But if you look at Laos or Cambodia, where stock exchanges have been set up recently, there are very, very few companies that have been listed. So I think it remains to be seen which local or even more foreign companies would like to list on the Yangon Stock Exchange when it is up and running. Actually, there are many Myanmar conglomerates or large Myanmar companies that will rather be looking at Singapore at a place where to list if they are interested in raising capital, for example.
How important is a stock exchange to Rangoon and to Burma?
Well, I think it's one element in the financial sector reform strategy, and it has a role to play when it comes to raising capital. I mean, a lot of the local companies, from SMEs to large conglomerates, are have limited access to capital. I mean, the banking sector is still at a very early stage of development. It does not have a very high capitalization level, and so often companies from SMEs again to large conglomerates see opportunities here, but because they do not have access to loans or to capital, these opportunities cannot be realized.
When this does get launched, do you have more faith in this than the previous one, the MSEC,
right,
that completely failed? I think there were 2 companies on that one and no one really knew what it was about. Do you have faith that this one may do better?
Well, it's important to keep in mind that the Myanmar Stock Exchange Commission, MSEC I think it's called, was launched in the mid-1990s, where Myanmar was experiencing its first boom. And this came to an end because of political issues, but also because of the Asian financial crisis in 1997. So suddenly that stock exchange did not really have a reason to be anymore. So now actually it's a lot of the same actors that are involved in setting up the new stock exchange, but the situation overall is very different. And Asia is undergoing an amazing period of growth, and there is still of course political instability here to some extent, but not in the same way as in the 1990s. So yes, overall I'm more optimistic about what will happen with this stock exchange. Well, thank you very much for this interview. I'm very glad to be interviewed by DVB in Yangon.
Thank you.